We're delighted to have Carol with us today, so welcome. Even the vast complex of parking garages at Boston College. Carol is an anthropologist and assistant professor in the marketing communications department at Emerson College. Her research is focused on the intersection of religion, education, and national identity. Just recently, she published a book entitled Muslim and Catholic Experiences of National Belonging in France by Bloomsburg Press. You have any things for us today to hand out here?
I don't, but I will display a code right here.
Okay, good. That is obvious. Yes. Thank you. She holds a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from BU and a dual MA degree in Islam and Middle Eastern Studies and International Affairs from the American University of Paris. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, it's such a pleasure to be here presenting what is my first book. Very long journey, so thank you.
Can you pass that around?
Yes, please. And thank you to Mark and to the Bossy Center. I've been saying that wrong. Bossy Center.
It's a Swiss French name.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. For hosting me, thank you to Maddie and Susan Richard for their help on the back end. Also, thank you to Elizabeth Prodromu, who put me in touch with Mark, and to Jonathan Lawrence, who not only was kind enough to write something on the back of the book, but who has been served as a mentor and a friend to me for many years. I'm missing one slide. It's not a big deal. But just to give you a sense of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time giving you some background in terms of how I got into this research in the first place. Then I'll go into talking about faith in the Republic, so religion in France, to help contextualize the study, and then I'll talk about my field sites, my field work, and then I'll do, I have two vignettes that help to sort of illustrate my main points and draw out my main questions. And then at the end, I'll present this concept of francité, which is a French national identity concept that I'll explain later. Okay, so in terms of how I got here, this is the book that you'll have in the background, the chapter outline, and here's a the code, discount code, if anyone's interested in purchasing the book. So in 2009, from 2009 to 2011, I was doing my master's degree at the American University in Paris, and I was working on religious tolerance and understanding in the French education system. And that gave me this foray into private Muslim schools in France. So I don't know if you know about French secularism, but there's a lot of loopholes, let's say. And one of those major loopholes, and the irony of ironies, is the fact that France subsidizes religious education. It was a sort of an agreement between the church and the state in the mid-20th century, and that led to that. But so when I'm there in 2009, 2011, private Muslim schools are just starting to emerge, and they had started at the beginning of the 2000s, partially in response to another thing that was happening at the time. In 2004, many of you might know that headscarves were banned, so the ban on ostentatious religious symbols in public schools. So girls that attended public French schools were no longer allowed to wear the headscarf, and they had to unveil upon entering the sacred Republican space. So that was going on. Muslim schools were starting to pop up. The first school got its state funding in 2008. And I found these Muslim schools to be really interesting for several reasons, which I'll get into later. But one of those reasons was they were facing really disproportionate hurdles for being able to just even open their doors compared to between 6,000 and 9,000 Catholic schools that are subsidized by the state in France. So that was really interesting. The other thing that was happening during this time period was these heated debates about French national identity, which are sort of, perennial, but just these heated debates and this idea that all of a sudden secularism was becoming a pillar of French national identity. So it was essential to be secular. And the French state was using secularism as a carrot, if you will. So, adhere to secular Republican values, and you too can find French belonging. So long as everyone is secular, everyone can be French, etc., etc. So being used as a carrot. And then there's a whole body of literature and scholars writing about how secularism was being used as a stick, so to oppress certain marginalized, or and marginalize certain populations, and especially with its Christian background. Tal al-Assad is writing about this, Saba Mahmoud, and many others, Mayanti Fernando in the French context, writing about how secularism is like ruining things, right? So as a stick. And then I went to do my dissertation at BU, and I was invited to participate in the Contending Modernities project out of Notre Dame, and that's actually how I met Jonathan. And that project had a necessarily Catholic element to it. And at first I was like, oh, it's really not my area of expertise. But it turned out to be such an auspicious endeavor, because I was able not just to look at Muslim experiences of national belonging and sort of this story of non-belonging, default non-belonging, as I'll say, but I was also then able to include majority experiences, so Catholic experiences of default belonging in the French context. So that turned out to be really great. So let's talk more about religion in France to understand what's going on. So not all these numbers are super interesting. This number is not very interesting. The Muslim population has been growing a little bit in France. Usually these are blown way out of proportion by youth. Sometimes I would ask youth in schools in France what they thought the percentage of, or the Muslim population was in France. They would give me numbers way upward of 30%, etc. Same in the US, though, actually, over at Emerson. Same kind of guesses. So it's like 1% in the US, just for the record. But this 25% number is really interesting. So this data came out in 2022, and I guess delays because of COVID. And for well into the 1950s, Catholic adherence was at like 80% in France. So it was very, very high, and it did start to wane. After the Second Vatican Council, after the revolutions of the 1960s, but it remained through the early 2000s. It remained pretty close to 40-50%, and then all of a sudden in 2022 or 2020, you see this massive drop down to 25%. And so when this study first came out, I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to mess up my study. But then I calmed myself down and thought about it, and I said, no, statistics don't actually matter. So if you ask people, is France a country of Catholic tradition and culture, the vast majority still say yes. Okay, so even if people aren't adhering to Catholicism, they still see and interpret France as being a Catholic country. And I'll be talking about the national imaginary a lot today, and that plays a really significant role in framing what we think of as who and what can be French. And I lean on Laurie Beeman's work for this, who says that religious hegemony is really not about statistics. It's about influence. It's about power. And what I discuss in the book is that throughout the 20th century, once we get away from the reign of terror in the late 18th century and the slaughtering of hundreds of priests, in the late 19th century, and this is particularly tied to the creation of the modern education system in France, the state and the church work very closely together, even though there's these really sharp tensions. And it's sort of born out of those tensions and that struggle, both Catholicism and laicité or secularism were able to maintain power. So despite waning numbers of adherents and sort of the challenges within the church, they were able to maintain some level of power and influence throughout the 20th century because of this special relationship that they had with the French state. We call that usually Catho-laïcité. Okay, so I was, as I said, I was already doing some field work in 2009, 2011, and then my dissertation work was mostly during 2013 to 2015. Notable events during this period was the same-sex marriage law being passed in 2013. That was everything that was going on at that particular moment, and the protests were really significant. And I do write about them in parts of the book. And if you'll note, I left in December of 2015. 2016 was the Charlie Hebdo terror attacks in France, and that sort of year of terror where there were several terror attacks. So when I left the field, Muslims already felt like they didn't belong in France. They were being, felt they were discriminated against. Youth felt that they couldn't be both French and Muslim at the same time. But then after the terror attacks, things only were exacerbated. I remember being on a phone call with a student from one of the Muslim schools who actually called me to tell me how scared she was because the TV crews were camped out at her school waiting for one of the students to say something positive about the terror attack so they could publish it. So she was sharing her concern with me. I returned to the field in 2019 as a Fulbright postdoc fellow, and that was very lucky because I was able to gain access to a traditionalist Catholic school, which is very rare and very hard to access, right before I got kicked out for COVID. So literally the weekend before. And what I do in the book, I like to say that I did a juxtapositional approach instead of like a comparative approach, one might say. So instead of looking at Muslim experiences and Catholic experiences and looking how they were similar or different, I was looking at them next to each other and seeing what we could learn about one set of experiences from the other. So really juxtaposing, putting two things next to each other to see what emerges from that juxtaposition. I did all kinds of things. Spent a lot of time just sitting in classrooms. Sometimes I would take over as the English teacher and I would draw hilariously inaccurate geographical maps of France and the US and ask kids what they thought of when they thought of those places. I went to catechism classes every week in multiple different churches. I hung out with a self-proclaimed neo-Salafi Muslim leader in a suburb of Paris who brought me to the most bizarre meetings. One of them was with a group of neo-Salafi folks with the communist candidate for mayor, and we were meeting in a Moroccan mosque. So, for example, these are the kinds of things I was doing. And I spent a lot of time in interfaith dialogue spaces. That was a really interesting place to look at how Muslim leaders and Catholic leaders came to the interfaith table on uneven ground, right? And thinking about those differences. So chapter 2 is all about the interfaith experiences. And I did more than 100 semi-structured interviews from everyone I spent a lot of time talking to recent private Muslim school graduates. I interviewed ordinary parishioners in the churches, folks that I went to catechism class with, and I even managed to get an interview with the former Archbishop of Lyon, who is no longer the Archbishop of Lyon for reasons that maybe you all already know about. Or we can talk about it later. And I mostly spent time in Paris, Lille, and Lyon because those were the spaces where the Muslim schools were primarily located. And my research then spilled out into the Muslim and Catholic communities surrounding those private Muslim schools. They're so rare that that's where I needed to focus my time. Yeah. So these are some photos from the private Muslim schools I spent time in. And I want to take a minute to talk about Licea Lopez. It doesn't look like much from this picture. I'm sure if I were to retake a picture, my fancier camera these days would take a better one. But it is just a building like any other building. So this is a school in Lille. It was the first school to get state funding in 2008, as I mentioned. I think I first visited the school in 2012. And just this past year, it had its funding revoked by the state. That is after having won several accolades, including best high school in France, in all of France at one point. Its high school graduates have gone on to do many wonderful things. And And I spent a lot of time in the school in a carte blanche. It took me a long time to earn the principal's trust, but finally he was like, "Ugh, she's so annoying, she's never going to go away," and he was like, "Fine, just come, just be." And we've remained in contact. He's actually no longer a principal at the school for political reasons, but we've remained in touch nonetheless. So I write about this in a few the conversation articles if you're interested to know more about the backstory of this school and how it lost its funding. But my argument is that it's mainly due to political reasons. The school has been surveilled and inspected exponentially more than any Catholic school of its Catholic school peers. And anyways, again, I invite you to read that article, and we can talk about it afterwards. Also, after Avorez had its funding revoked, Al-Kindi, which is this building, this Bloomsburg, Al-Kindi, which is located in the suburbs of Lyon, also has had its funding revoked, and there are almost no schools, Muslim schools left with state funding at this moment in time. So while I was never writing a rosy story about Muslim schools, early in my research, they did seem like this important beacon because they were allowing French Muslim youth to find a coherent French Muslim identity, and that was a big part of their project and why I was so interested in their schools. So chapter 5 is all about these schools as well, and sort of the different experiences I had in sort of the complicated, uneven territory between Catholic and Muslim schools. The other thing about the Muslim schools is, especially the ones that were funded by the state, they really were always bending over backwards to adhere to these secular Republican values, which was a sharp contrast to the work that I did with the traditionalist Catholics of the Society of St. Pius X, SSPX, at the Church of Saint-Nicolas de Chardonnay. So I don't know if any of you have been to Paris, but Saint-Nicolas de Chardonnay is right in the heart of Paris, right there, just for everyone to see. And as you'll see, this is a woman in a headscarf, very common within this church, which again was this striking irony as I was moving through the Muslim communities where people were reprimanded, for any kind of veiling usually. So if you're not familiar, traditionalist Catholicism is sort of a big minority group within Catholicism that has lots of different branches, but the Society of St. Pius X specifically is a specific order of traditionalist Catholicism. They have been excommunicated by the Vatican because of their refusal to accept the Second Vatican Council. So no interfaith dialogue. That was actually that's the opening vignette of chapter 6, where I go into this dialogue, and they have set themselves up throughout the audience and disrupt the interfaith dialogue with intention.
Deep anti-Semitism.
Deep, all kinds of everything. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's also a royalist organization, so they call for a restoration of the monarchy, and it was their school that I was able to gain access to. And so they teach anti-Republican values. They teach the evils of the French Revolution as being sort of the beginning of the moral decline of France. They teach that laïcité is an evil, very anti-modernity, and very anti-Republican. And so what really stood out to me was the way they were able to break all of the secular Republican rules, yet they're here in the middle of Paris, holding their publicly, open to the public catechism classes every Saturday, compared to the Muslim schools who had to work so hard to demonstrate their allegiance to the Republic, even though they're French citizens, even though they're an institution like any other. And while this might not be that surprising of a contrast to some of us, or that it might be expected, it's very hard to demonstrate, and there's a lot of resistance to that way to that possibility in France, that there is this unequal footing. So that's why I did this study.
And they're receiving public funding.
No. So I should clarify. Their school does not receive public funding, but they are able to operate. So there's been several Muslim schools that don't receive public funding that have been shut down because of not adhering to secular values.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's unequal footing even in the not state-funded space in terms of how the schools are able to operate. Yeah. Okay, so this leads me to my vignettes. So meet Aisha. Aisha grows up in the 93rd department of France, which is in the northern suburbs of Paris. This has been deemed the Mecca of France by Gilles Capel, for example. It has a high Muslim population. It is also known, it became notorious sort of in the 2005 riots, for example, when the two youth were chased down by police and killed. Not by the police, but they died in that chase. And so she grows up here. She wants to be a deputy when she grows up. She is really great at academics, studies really hard. When she gets to high school, she decides to wear the headscarf, but always unveils dutifully upon entering the school. And she actually studies hard enough to get into Sciences Po. So Sciences Po is one of the most prestigious political science universities in France. And she's really excited about this because her peers have told her that the school is really inclusive and that she's going to feel welcome. So she's really excited about going there. Again, she wants to be a deputy, so this would be a good path for her to follow. And she gets there, and Sciences Po is ironically just down the street from this church, really. And so she gets there, and that's a sharp contrast. It's a palpable difference in just when you walk through that space compared to the 93rd, right? You take the train from the 93rd down into the center of Paris, and it just feels really different already. Feels very bourgeois in where Sciences Po is. And she's trying to find belonging. She's trying to find ways to build up a community at the school, and everyone keeps telling her that she should join the Muslim Student Association. She's like, why do I have to just be a Muslim in this space? Why can't I just be an ordinary Sciences Po student? And she becomes really jaded. And at the time that I met her, she had dropped out of Sciences Po. She had turned to a very conservative practice of her religion, much to the chagrin of her parents. And she was actively seeking pathways out of France. And she told me, honestly, in this moment, being French means forgetting oneself. We forget ourselves. France has always taught me to forget myself, to be different than I am. Unity for France is uniformity. So then we meet Samuel. I met Samuel at the SSPX catechism courses. He was really interested to talk to me. Why is this American sitting in on our catechism classes? And he grew up in a Catholic family, not particularly pious, not going to church maybe every single Sunday, but certainly for holidays, etc. And it wasn't until the same-sex marriage law was passed that he decided he really needed to turn back to the church. As he said, France is just going in this direction of moral decline that I don't understand. And the discourse that he resonated most with was the SSPX church, and that discourse that they played a major role in those protests. So even though it's a very small branch in order, in the grand scheme of things, they've had significantly more influence in the past decade or two in the mainstream church because of the conservative turn in the mainstream church. So the SSPX voices are being heard more and more, and there's a pretty high percentage now of new priests ordained who follow the Latin Rite and the traditionalists, to take their rights in the traditionalist form. So he turns back to the church, and when I was talking to him, he said, France in its origins is one and indivisible. We are one nation, one culture, one identity. All that matters is that you're French, that you live like a French person. And what really struck me about Samuel and Aisha and many of the conversations I had was that they're saying the same thing. Okay, Samuel and Aisha are saying the same thing. Except Samuel is saying it from a place of belonging, right? From the inside. He's saying, I am France, right? I represent French identity and I can tell you about myself. Whereas Aisha is telling me about French identity, along with many of the Muslim youth I talked with, are talking about French identity as something other than their own identities, right? They're talking about it from the outside looking in. And that really is the heart of the story that I'm telling, which is based on this question: are French secular values really the gatekeepers of French identity? Because if you'll remember when I first began the talk, and I was mentioning that secularism was being touted as a pillar of French national identity, a necessity for being French, and it's being used as a carrot by the French state, as this thing that, if everyone plays by the French secular republican rules, everyone will fit in and everyone will find belonging. And the story that I tell, my research has shown that that is simply not the case. Instead, I argue that secularism is being used as a facade for what I call francité. So francité can be understood as a tacit national imaginary ideal type, draws on narratives of nationalism and colonialism. It contains those sticky conflations between race, ethnicity, and religion that scholars are consistently trying to sort of tease apart from one another. And while you can do that analytically, potentially, some scholars have done it and done quite a compelling job of that. I argue that in the national imaginary, so in our minds, the way that our minds work, it's just not effective. You can't actually tease those things. The other term will always fill in the blanks for us in our minds when we're thinking about others. Normative shared cultural markers and aesthetics, so what people should look like, right? That matters also. Sociability, how we interact with each other, language, sociocultural norms. And I argue that this contributes significantly to cognitive biases. And this might be, for example, as simple or let's say innocuous as someone walking down the street. They encounter a woman wearing a hijab or some form of veil, and they think something to themselves, right? And their cognitive biases become reified. So that might happen. But in a collective sense, it also might mean that a group of legislators come together, and because of their cognitive biases, they're able to enact legislation that from the outside looks clearly discriminatory towards a certain population, but within that group, that with the collective national biases that exist, that legislation looks entirely fine, right, and non-discriminatory. So that's where I think it's a real, a dangerous problem. So francité can also be thought of as the je ne sais quoi Frenchness. Imponderabilia, like Malinowski writes about, sort of this intangible stuff. And I actually borrowed the term from Léopold Senghor, who was the first president of Senegal, notably kind of put into power as a puppet of the French state, but he was an author and a poet in his own right. And he's writing about francité in the 1960s alongside his work on négritude. And he's writing about it as an aspirational concept for newly decolonized French nations to aspire to. And he writes about it as something that would allow for hybrid identities and the maintenance of the expression of both identities, importantly. He says very specifically that one is not supposed to assimilate into francité, but that, it's this enriching concept to make things better. And most importantly, he notes that the only way that this can be an aspirational concept is if France manages to culturally decolonize, lest it become a coercive hegemonic concept. And so that's what I argue has happened today. So France has not managed to culturally decolonize. These these collective national cognitive biases are being more and more entrenched. We can see this in the legislation that has been enacted. The 2021 law was actually called the Law to Reinforce Secular Republican Principles. And my argument is that if you really look at that law, it talks a lot about secularism, But it's really about the protection of French national identity. It's not about secularism. Because if it was about secularism, then Aisha and Samuel should both feel belonging in France. And the important thing, like, takeaway from this, that I get is that, there's a lot of scholars who sort of throw secularism out with the bathwater of the baggage of, it's too Christian, we can't apply it everywhere, it has all these biases written into secularism already. But I still see it as a hopeful concept that could undergird a pluralistic society, and I think it's an important concept as it relates to a secular democracy being, a strong system of governance with equality, liberty, and fraternity. And what I argue is that majoritarian discourses of national identity, like francité, are distorting and betraying these values in a way that then is detrimental to democracy, as we might be able to look around and see in lots of places, not just in France, obviously. And the way to fix this, obviously if I knew, I probably wouldn't be talking to you all here, but I have a lot of arguments about trying to improve education systems and working to, take steps back and think about the way we frame things, because it's really that national imaginary, I think, plays a really significant role. And we can all think of examples of folks who've managed to manipulate the national imaginary in really significant ways to make powerful change, maybe not the change we would hope for, but if they're able to do that, then we should be able to too, but for the better. Thank you so much.
Carol, you have a question?
Yes, please.
Okay, it's ironic in business. I was in New Hampshire last night talking about my book on Catholic fundamentalism, and one of the chapters is on St. Mary's, Kansas, which is a small town completely controlled by the Society of St. Pius.
Oh, really?
It's very interesting. Yeah.
They were excited to talk to me about the U.S.
No, exactly. And I was very interested because there was a cover story in the Atlantic about 4 years ago called The Christian Withdrawal Experiment. But we can talk about that.
Yeah.
I have two questions. One about UCT and one about integralism. What do you mean by secularism? As you know, secularism is a word that can mean 1,000. Like Martin Marty has three models. So there's sort of utter secularity, which is the attack on religion, or there's mere secularity, which is religion becomes irrelevant. But he says that in the United States, neither one of those two, but it's controlled secularism, which means you can be religious as long as it's private. And indeed, the society is built on the theory that the majority of its citizens will be religious, but you're not allowed to bring those things into the public sphere. Second question about the integralists. There are two people who are off their medications. One's Adrian Vermeule at Harvard Law School, and the other one is Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame Law School, and they're integralists. And they've written direct attacks on the First Amendment. They think that separation of church and state and religious freedom is wrong, and we should go back to throne and altar. There should be one church and one state. Everybody should be forced to become Catholic. Protestants and Jews have no right to worship separately. I think it's performative, but it sounds a lot like what you were describing from the SSPX. So either one of those, if you could comment on what you mean by l'unicité,
sure,
and how integralist you would consider the Society of St. Pius X.
Yeah, thank you. So actually, I'm gonna answer the second one first. So they certainly believe in a restoration of the monarchy. Not all of the parishioners I spoke with buy into all aspects of their discourse. I think that's important to mention. However, some of them certainly do. When pressed and say, what do you do with the people, the other people, once you restore the monarchy, then the answer to that was usually they leave or they face consequences. So that was very real for sure. I think I write about this in an article that I write about the schools called Breaking the Republican Mold, and I write about Chantal Mousse theory of agonistic pluralism and whether or not we can sort of include them at the table if they're rejecting democracy in the first place, which I think is really interesting to think about, right? If you're rejecting the principles upon which are you even allowed to sit at the table with us? But I argue that they're playing by the democratic rules fleetingly enough to function within the system, and so that by rejecting them, we're actually that would be detrimental. So we do need to include them at the table. But I think they are, for all intents and purposes, integralists. They're known as, I talk about the different ways that they're referred to, and the ways they refer to themselves. Lefebvristes, after Lefebvre, who was the one who started that movement. But anyways, yes, very integrist. What do I mean by laïcité? So I use secularism instead of laïcité when I'm talking, because it's easier. But I do actually use, I think I ended up using laïcité in the book. The editors and I had a long conversation about that. But I mean it going back to the original way that it was framed in the French context, and its spirit. So, in France, the war was over, trying to be free from religion, whereas in the U.S. it's freedom to religion, right? It's a freedom of religion instead of from religion. And so that's an important distinction. But I think the original framers, if you will, of secularism in the French context also expected people to be Catholic. That's been written about, like Bobéro writes about how everyone really was Catholic who was at that table deciding all of these things, but that they meant it as something that would allow politics to be free from that control. So that's how I see it. But instead now, again, I feel like it's being leveraged. I mean, now, Marine Le Pen, well, who's no longer allowed to run, but she has been using it as, everyone talks about secular. Everyone's embracing secular. Left, far right, everyone. So it's lost its meaning, and that's why I just think it's being used as this facade for whatever kind of agenda you want to push underneath of it. And now it's lost all of its meaning. So that's the form of secularism.
Questions?
Thank you for this presentation. It's very interesting. I am curious to hear more about the narrative that the French government uses when they're shutting down the Muslim school. So neither the Muslim school nor the SSPX school had government funding, but the Catholic one was allowed to continue and the Muslim one wasn't. What, even though that we know that it's obviously wrong, what narratives does the government use when they're doing these kinds of things?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so to clarify, the one Muslim school that I spent all that time in was state funded, so they did not get shut down. Okay. They had their funding revoked.
So they're still existing, just with a different source of funding.
Yeah. However, there are lots of Muslim schools that don't receive state funding, and many of those have been shut down for a variety of reasons, but often with some kind of citation of not adhering to being French enough, not adhering to secular values, not teaching laïcité properly, or suspicions of terrorism. But the SSPX schools have been around for decades. That school that I visited has been there since the 1980s, teaching the same rhetoric, which matched perfectly with the rhetoric we were getting in catechism. They were mirror images of themselves, and there's more than 200 of those schools that teach just from SSPX. And actually, the one I went to technically wasn't run by SSPS, but they used the SSPS manuals in their classrooms. So yes, the inspectors. Okay, so in the Muslim schools that have been shut down or had their funding revoked, the funding revoked has been discussed as being financial manipulation or some kind of mismanagement of funds, which might be true, but there's also lots of examples of Catholic schools mismanaging funds that do not receive the same treatment. And as I mentioned, and this is well documented, those schools have been surveilled and inspected exponentially more than their Catholic or secular peers that have received funding. So the rhetoric is generally anti-terrorism, anti-French values, or simple things like they don't have a lab, biology lab, or they don't have the proper sanitation systems, which I've not been able to individually verify.
Dan?
I'm noticing that one of the terms not being employed in the social discourse in France that's common in the U.S., it seems, is something like religious toleration. I mean, I use a pluralism here, but the notion of toleration doesn't quite seem to be at play here. Am I missing something, or is that kind of language not part of the discourse in France?
Well, so I'm using pluralism.
Right,
No one
right.
in France would use pluralism.
Okay.
I don't think.
Right. So the idea that, like, in this nation state, we tolerate many different sorts of religious traditions. Is that an implicit assumption within laicite or no?
Yeah, I mean, that's written into law. I mean, that's like non-discrimination or favoritism toward religion is part of the Constitution.
Right.
So, but they don't want any. There's no religion in the public sphere. And what's happening though is the public sphere is creeping increasingly into the private sphere, right? So at first it was just public school students who couldn't wear headscarves. Then they toyed with, well, maybe it should also be private school students. Maybe we should do this. First it was just public employees of the state who couldn't wear the headscarf, who had to adhere to these secular values. And now it's increasingly the case that private corporations can implement those same rules. But in terms of religious toleration, it's not discussed as much because there's just no religion, right? That's the official voice. Even though Catholicism, as my study showed, and Elaine Oliphant also writes this in the Privilege of Being Banal is the title of her book, where she talks about sort of the dominant ways that Catholicism fills French space. Yeah.
So you kind of bring in the backstory that maybe the things that you're talking about are coinciding with the rise of a modern French education. So I wonder what role it being modern plays into that. So is it a factor of modernity to be secular, or is it a factor of modernity that these things are happening, or what you mean by those things working together?
Mm-hmm. So I referenced the rise of the modern education system as being like in the late 19th century. And in the construction of the modern French education system, yes, I think secularism was worked slowly but surely into that model as a marker of modernity, for sure. That's the way it was imagined, at least. Whether or not I agree with that is a whole other topic that we don't have time for, probably. But so, yes, what was the second part of your question?
So thinking with that, what is, I guess that you kind of answered it, but this idea of like secularism fitting into modernity. But
yeah, I do talk about something related to that, really about Islam, religion, and modernity, and its intersection with secularism and modernity in the schools. Because the state has certainly touted this idea that secularism allows for this more modern idea of the mieux vivre ensemble, living better together living together better than religion. Religion is really not as compatible with modernity. That's why students don't learn about it in school unless it's in history lessons or geography lessons. So it can be mapped out and it can be talked about in a historical context, but it can't be discussed as a contemporary, modern, living, breathing thing.
In your slide on francité, the images you had, bring it up. Yeah, thank you. I'm looking at Paris and I see the Eiffel Tower, l'Arc de Triomphe. Why is not the Notre Dame of Paris in there? Especially because am I aware that is a property of the city of Paris?
Yes. So I can't really answer that because I just scraped these from the internet. But I will say that when I did those classroom activities, I don't think anyone ever said Notre Dame during those, like no students ever said, that's what I think of when I think of France. But I actually did write an article after the fire that talked about how it was actually a friend of mine who posted something on Facebook in support. He was a Muslim a young Muslim person who I actually met in Coexiste, which is an interfaith group in France, and he had posted something in solidarity and in expressing empathy and sadness over the burning of Notre Dame, and he was attacked for like, you're Muslim, how could you, like, what do you have to do with this? And then because there was this heated debate on whether or not it could be a French symbol because it's Catholic, but it's French. And there are all these people arguing that it's not really Catholic, it's a French institution. But then obviously to a Catholic, it's deeply Catholic, right? It's this 100-year-old church. And so that created a lot of deep animosity and sentiment between these different populations.
I had a question about the state engagement with these schools, the association contract and all of that. Excuse me, because at the origin, the regulation of schools and of religious education is not consonant with religious freedom. I mean, it's sort of actually trying to control the parameters of religion and make sure that the curriculum includes the national curriculum in addition to whatever they're going to do. So paradoxically, by shutting these groups out of their regulatory framework, they're actually missing this opportunity to surveil the terrain that they're most interested in. So what happens then? Like, so if you don't have any schools that are under association contract, can you just open up like 1901 law associations and just have like secondary associations that are basically functioning as after-school programs, and if it's not state funding, then like it's very hard to bring in money. So where's the money coming from?
So what's really I'm going to go with yucky about this is that before they revoked all these contracts, the 2018 and 2021 laws shut off the valves, let's say, of how you might do damage control for getting your funding revoked. So they made very strict laws about any kind of foreign funding whatsoever going to any kind of establishment like this. They made it so that you had to have French nationality to be a teacher, which is a very strict law. It was present in Germany, I know, for example, but otherwise it's quite uncommon and certainly was not the case, and obviously disproportionately affects Muslim schools compared to Catholic schools. So they shut off those systems. They also reduced the mandatory age of attending school from 6 down to 3, right when I went, actually, and so my 3-year-old was, I mean, I would have sent him anyways, but he was obliged to attend school because we were there and he was a 3-year-old. That was during the postdoc. And so they've shut off all of these alternative systems. And they keep closing the non-contracted schools also, so there's like no out. And they made it so that you couldn't homeschool. They made it nearly impossible to homeschool, which did seriously piss off the Catholic constituents. There's like the SSPX, the traditionalist Catholics are often homeschool. They often have very many children, and they end up homeschooling because they don't agree with, obviously, the public school system. So they tried to push back on that a little bit, and they got a little bit of wiggle room, but very little. So I don't know what will happen, but I wrote about that like many years ago already, and how it was disappointing. There was already in 2016, there was that stall. All of a sudden, there had been a lot of support for the Muslim schools for years, and Darmanin came in 2016, Macron shut down.
Well, November 13th came in.
Yeah. Well, and Charlie Hebdo, all of it. So those, so I don't know what will happen, but as I really argue, again, for years, it's only making things worse, and I'm happy to be looking towards other topics because I think I've said all I can say about this topic. So my next research project is about Boston schools instead. Yes, please.
Thanks, Carol. This is a really interesting talk, and I've been relying on John Bowen's work for a lot of these issues, so I really appreciate the comparative perspective that you're giving to it. I have a question that is sort of about what do we mean by piety when we're talking about France? And I think the devil's advocate side of the question is, it seems like religiosity for a lot of French people is a very kind of inward kind of commitment, and so it's very private, but maybe that's just a privilege of Catholicity in France. And so I know that your research focus was on pious individuals and communities, but what kind of, when you're thinking about it, doing your field work, what kind of indicators or markers were you looking for to signal for you piety as like being a fruitful kind of research subject?
That's a good question. This is why I tended to stick closely to interfaith dialogue, religious education, like actual schools that taught religion, and Catholic schools actually don't fit into that, because a lot of people send their kids to Catholic schools just for the social mobility aspect. So that's why I actually talk about, I don't really do much work in the Catholic schools because of that. So I was looking for spaces where religion really needed to be a pretty important part of your daily life in order, to be part of the study. So, and I think almost everywhere that I went, that was the case. So not just folks who show up on Easter to Mass, right? So when I went to Mass and I would talk to people, it was people who was an ordinary Mass on Sundays. And I did that specifically because I did want to see what it was like to be Muslim and try and live your pious life in secular France compared to being a Catholic and living your pious life. And a lot of those questions were raised. But what's really interesting about the traditionalist Catholics, I mean, they hold a massive parade on August 15th every year through the center of Paris. They get a permit every year to do this, and they have public prayer in the street. And I juxtapose this in the book about the Muslim prayer ban that has been enacted in certain parts of Paris, in the suburbs of Paris. So not all Catholics are as private about their religion, right? And that was what was interesting about the traditionalist Catholic case. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
The last question. Dan?
I work in Jewish-Christian relations, and so I was thinking of the Jewish population in France, and are there parallel dynamics with inspection of Jewish schools? I know, like for the state of New York, is very concerned about the Hasidic school educational processes, and they've become very restrictive. Is there a parallel process with that maps onto francité?
So my second advisor at BU was Kimberly Arkin, who worked on Jewish schools for a hot minute, but then was dismissed from them. But she writes about how the state just turns the other way for Jewish schools. And there, I mentioned this also in the book, but they're afforded this level of ignorance, if you will, that Muslim schools could never garner. And Kimberly she writes about how they do break a lot of rules. But
right, so that could be put into this conversation about French identity.
I was not. I was only one person, first of all, doing this rather extensive field work, and just didn't have the access to the Jewish schools and communities that I would have taken me a long time. It already took me, however many, 5, 6, 7 years to get into that Catholic school. So, yeah.
Please join me in thanking Carol.